The sound wasn't a drip. It was a violent tearing of the curated silence I'd spent 10 years perfecting. Water cascaded down the study wall, threatening first editions and the sanity I held onto by a thread. I called every number in the county, begging against weekend emergency rates, until one dispatcher sighed and promised a truck. It arrived 20 minutes later, a battered green beast coughing smoke as it died in my driveway. I threw open the door, desperate for salvation, only to find my high school nightmare standing on the welcome mat holding a pipe wrench. My life is built on specific, non-negotiable pillars: order, silence, and the absolute absence of chaos. I am a woman who color codes her bookshelf. I left this town to become someone untouchable, someone who couldn't be cornered in a locker room or mocked for the way she walked. Standing in the doorway, staring at the woman wiping rain from her forehead, I felt those pillars turn to dust. It was Hazel, but not the Hazel who used to flick paper clips at the back of my head in homeroom. This was a different creature entirely. The lanky, sharp-elbowed cruelty of adolescence had filled out into something solid and formidable. She wore canvas work pants that had seen better decades and a t-shirt that strained against shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the roof she was here to fix. "Camilla," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a voice that had dropped an octave, roughened by years of something I couldn't name. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a trapped bird realizing the cage door was open, but the hawk was waiting. I wanted to slam the door. I wanted to tell her to leave, to take her tools and her sudden, terrifying presence off my property. But behind me, the water was still gushing, a relentless reminder that my carefully constructed sanctuary was drowning. "The dispatcher said you had a main line breach," she continued, her eyes scanning my face with a professional detachment that felt more insulting than a sneer. "You gonna let me in, or do we let the foundation rot?" I stepped back. It was a surrender, and we both knew it. She stepped over the threshold, and the atmosphere in the hallway shifted instantly. The scent of lavender and old paper, the smell of my safety, was obliterated by the damp, metallic tang of rain, wet drywall, and the distinct, earthy scent of cedar sawdust clinging to her clothes. She moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, her boots squeaking faintly on the hardwood. I watched her walk toward the sound of the water, paralyzed by the cognitive dissonance. This was the person who had made me hate myself at 16, now marching into my kitchen to save me from disaster. The air in the hallway, usually still and cool, felt suddenly charged, thick with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't just the storm outside, it was the sudden intrusion of a chaotic element into a closed system. I watched her assess the damage. She didn't look like a bully anymore. She looked like a force of nature contained in workwear. I remembered her hands being cruel, shoving and pointing. Now those same hands were scarred, grease-stained, and holding a wrench with an ease that spoke of absolute capability. My brain was trying to reconcile the memory of the girl who laughed at my poetry with the woman who was currently kneeling on my expensive rug, unbothered by the water soaking into her knees. It was a violent shift in perspective. The power dynamic had flipped, or perhaps it had just twisted into a new, unrecognizable shape. I was the client, the one with the checkbook and the degrees, yet I felt small. I felt exposed. She was the one with the tools. She was the one who knew how to stop the bleeding. She turned the water off at the main valve with a grunt of exertion, the silence that followed deafening. The rushing noise stopped, leaving only the sound of her breathing and the rain against the glass. She looked up at me from the floor, wiping a smear of water from her cheek. Her eyes were the same startling green, but the malice was gone, replaced by a guarded, weary competence. She didn't smirk. She didn't mock. She just looked at me, unflinching, waiting for permission to invade the spaces I kept hidden. "That's the immediate bleed stopped," she said, her voice rough like gravel. "But the pipe is shot. I need to get into the wall." She waited. I nodded, mute. The tension wasn't just fear anymore, it was a physical weight, a pressure drop before a tornado. I retreated to the doorway, leaning against the frame for support, watching her work. She was a stranger and a ghost all at once, and I was terrified to find out which one would leave when the rain stopped. When the dispatch notification first flashed on my dashboard, the name Camila Vargas hit me with the force of a physical blow. I sat in the idling truck for 2 minutes, wipers slapping a frantic rhythm, debating if I could just drive away. The transmission was slipping, my rent was late, and the emergency rate was the only thing keeping my business afloat. But the cost of walking through that door felt steeper than any invoice. I knew exactly who lived at 104 Maple. I knew because I had spent 4 years making sure she felt unwelcome everywhere else. The guilt wasn't a ghost, it was a lead weight in my gut. But necessity is a cruel mechanic, so I put the truck in gear, practicing my professional detachment like a rehearsed script. Stepping into her hallway felt like breaking into a museum. The air smelled of lavender, a space curated for silence that I was currently ruining. I felt the sheer size of myself. My boots were too heavy on the hardwood, my shoulders too broad for the corridors. I saw the way she had built this life. It was defensive architecture. Every book aligned, every surface clear. And here I was, the embodiment of her worst chaotic memories, tracking rainwater onto her sanctuary floor. I kept my face locked in a neutral expression, a mask of bored competence. If I let her see the shame burning the back of my neck, the dynamic would shift, and I needed to be the plumber right now. I scanned the walls, forcing my brain to focus on the structure rather than the woman standing rigid against the doorframe. The house had good bones, mid-century lines preserved with obsessive care, but I spotted the weaknesses. The settling crack above the molding, the slight bow in the floor. It was perfect on the surface, but underneath, the pressure was building. "Kitchen first," I muttered, the words rough. I moved past her, careful to keep a wide berth. The kitchen was worse, smaller, more intimate. The smell of lemon verbena was sharp. I dropped my tool bag by the farmhouse sink. The leak was likely in the supply line, tucked back against the firewall. I sighed, looking at the narrow cabinet doors. This was going to be a nightmare of leverage. I lay on my back, sliding my shoulders into the dark cavity under the sink. The transition was instant, from the sterile kitchen to the damp, claustrophobic underbelly. The particle board pressed against my ribs, and the smell down here was raw. Wet wood, old soap, and the metallic tang of copper. It was a confined, dark box, forcing me to be alone with my noise. My breath sounded too loud. I reached up, my hand fumbling blindly for the shutoff. A bead of cold water dripped onto my cheek, tracking down toward my ear like a tear I hadn't earned the right to shed. I found the source, a corroded compression nut, weeping steady tears. I could fix it, but not dry. If I cracked this seal, the water would dump onto the cabinet floor, ruining the wood she prized. I patted the dark space around me. Nothing. Just a dry sponge. I was stuck, wedged under the sink of the woman I'd tormented, unable to finish without asking for help. The irony tasted like rust. I slid back out, blinking against the harsh overhead lights, and looked up at her. "I can't clear the line without a catch basin," I said. the request stripping away my professional distance. I need a bucket, and I'm going to need you to hold the light. Retrieving the bucket felt absurdly mundane for a moment that felt like an execution. I found a red plastic pail in the laundry room, the handle digging into my palm as I walked back to the kitchen. My house, usually a fortress of solitude, now felt breached. The air was different, heavier, smelling of rain and the intruder. When I returned, Hazel was already back on the floor, her upper body swallowed by the cabinet, leaving only her hips and legs visible. Her work boots were scuffed, the leather worn soft at the ankles, one sole caked with the mud of my driveway. It was a still life of blue-collar reality in the middle of my pristine white tile. Light, her voice echoed from the cavern under the sink. It was a command, not a request. I knelt. It was a surrender of dignity I hadn't prepared for. My knees hit the hard tile and I clicked the flashlight on, aiming the beam into the dark recess of the cabinet. The circle of light cut through the gloom, illuminating the intricate, ugly guts of my house. And her. The space was impossibly small. Hazel was contorted around the P-trap, her shoulder jammed against the plywood divider. The flashlight beam caught the side of her face, slick with sweat, her jaw set in a line of intense concentration. She wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on the weeping joint above her. She held a hand out, palm up, fingers stained with dark grease. "Channel locks," she grunted. I fumbled in the tool bag she'd left open. The tools were heavy, cold, and alien to me. I grabbed the pliers with the blue handles and placed them in her hand. Her fingers closed around the metal, confident and sure. There was no hesitation. In my world, everything was theoretical, arguments, papers, abstract concepts. Here, in the dark under my sink, the world was binary, broken or fixed, leaking or dry. And she was the arbiter of that reality. I watched her work. I couldn't help it. The flashlight was a spotlight, and she was the reluctant performance. As she torqued the wrench, the muscles in her forearm corded tight, shifting beneath skin that was tanned and scarred. A small white line ran across her knuckles, a slip of a wrench from years ago, maybe? I found myself tracing the anatomy of her strength. This wasn't the lanky, sharp violence of the girl who had tripped me in the cafeteria. This was a different kind of power. It was productive. It was capable. The confident explorer part of my brain, the part that analyzed desire in the abstract for my thesis, noted the shift before I allowed myself to feel it. The fear. The cold, sharp spike of adrenaline I'd felt at the door was metabolizing into something else. It was melting into a reluctant, heavy appreciation. There is a specific, dangerous intimacy in watching someone fix what you cannot. It forces you to acknowledge your own helplessness and their utility. "Hold the pipe," she said. "The top one, it's spinning." I didn't argue. I reached into the cabinet. The air in there was stifling, smelling of lemon cleaner and the warm cedar and sweat scent of her. I wrapped my hand around the PVC pipe she indicated. My arm brushed against hers. The contact was electric, not a spark, but a current. Her skin was burning hot, damp with exertion, a shocking contrast to the cold pipe in my grip. I froze. She froze. For a second, the only sound was the drip of water into the bucket I'd shoved in the corner. The static shock of her proximity made my breath hitch. I was inches from her face. I could see the pores of her skin, the dark lashes that I used to envy, the way a bead of sweat tracked from her temple down the strong column of her neck, disappearing into the collar of her gray t-shirt. I should have pulled away. I should have recoiled from the touch of the person who had made my teenage years a hellscape. But the anger was slow to rise, sluggish against the sudden, sharp clarity of her presence. She was solid. She was real. She was fixing my house. "Steady," she murmured. Her voice was lower now, lacking the command, vibrating in the small space between us. "I've got it," I whispered back. My voice sounded foreign, breathless, and thin. She turned the wrench. The metal groaned, a harsh shriek of friction, and then gave. She tightened it down, her movements fluid and practiced. I watched her hands, those hands, manipulate the tool with a grace that was almost beautiful. It was confusing. It was infuriating. How dare she be good at this? How dare she be competent and strong and smell like rain? "That's got it," she said, releasing the tension. I pulled my arm back as if burned, scrambling backward out of the cabinet. She followed, sliding out and sitting up, wiping her hands on a rag tucked into her belt. She ran a hand through her hair, pushing damp strands off her forehead, and looked at me. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, filled with the ghost of that accidental touch. "Sinks dry," she said, her chest heaving slightly. But the pressure drop didn't stop. That wasn't the main leak. She pointed a grease-stained finger toward the floor. "It's below us, the main line in the basement." The basement was a different kingdom entirely. If the upstairs was Camilla's curated sanctuary of light and order, this was the house's subconscious, dark, utilitarian, and smelling of damp concrete and secrets. I descended the wooden stairs, the treads groaning under my boots, leaving the scent of lemon verbena behind for the heavy metallic odor of the furnace and the deeper, earthier smell of the foundation. The air down here was 10 degrees cooler, a subterranean chill that settled instantly against my sweat-damp skin. I found the main stack in the far corner, hidden behind a graveyard of cardboard boxes labeled thesis drafts and winter coats. It was an old cast-iron beast, the kind they stopped using 40 years ago, weeping rusty tears down its side. The main shutoff valve was ancient, a wheel of red iron seized by decades of oxidation. I set my toolbox down on the concrete floor, the clang echoing too loudly in the low-ceilinged space. Kneeling on the cold slab, I ran my gloved hand over the pipe. It was cold and rough, pitted with age. This was the real work. The kitchen sink was just a symptom. This was the disease. I grabbed my heavy pipe wrench, adjusting the jaws with a thumb flick, and clamped it onto the valve stem. It didn't budge. It was frozen solid, calcified by time and neglect. I braced my boot against the wall and pulled. The physical strain was immediate, a burning line of fire across my shoulders and down my back. I gritted my teeth, focusing entirely on the metal, trying to force my will upon the iron, but as my muscles trembled with the effort, my mind slipped the leash I'd kept on it since I walked through her front door. I was wrestling with a rusted valve, but I was thinking about the monster I used to be. The word bully feels too small, too playground. I was an architect of misery. I remembered the sound of my own laugh in the high school hallway, sharp, cruel, designed to cut. I remembered targeting Camilla specifically because she was everything I wasn't: quiet, contained, secure. I had been a chaotic storm of insecurity and rage, lashing out at anything that looked stable. I had wanted to break her composure just to see if she would bleed like the rest of us. And now I was the one on my knees in the dark, trying to keep her world from falling apart. The irony wasn't lost on me, it was choking me. I wasn't that angry kid anymore. I had rebuilt myself, pipe by pipe, job by job. I had learned that strength wasn't about breaking things, it was about fixing them. But standing in her house, under the floorboards where she walked, I felt the phantom weight of my old sins. I was a different woman, yes, but did that matter if the damage I left behind was permanent? The valve gave a high-pitched shriek of protesting metal and turned a quarter inch. There, I breathed, sweat stinging my eyes. Don't fight me. A floorboard creaked above, then the distinct rhythm of footsteps on the stairs. I didn't turn around. I kept my focus on the wrench, my back to the room, but every nerve ending on my dorsal side lit up. I could feel her presence like a change in barometric pressure. She stopped on the bottom landing. She didn't speak. She was just watching. The silence that stretched between us was heavier than the cast iron in front of me. It wasn't the companionable silence of a job site. It was a loaded, suffocating thing. I could hear the furnace kick on, a low rumble that vibrated through the floor, but it did nothing to drown out the noise in my head. She was standing there, looking at my back, likely remembering every time I'd shoved past her, every time I'd made her feel small. And I was down here, fixing her pipes, taking her money, pretending like we were just strangers. I gave the wrench one final savage pull. The valve groaned and spun free. The water flow to the house was completely killed. The immediate crisis was contained. I slowly lowered the wrench, my breathing heavy in the quiet. I could just pack up. I could finish the job, write the invoice, and walk out the door. I could leave the past buried in the dark like this plumbing, but the air in the basement felt too thin, compressed by the weight of everything unsaid. The strictly business mask I'd worn at the door had cracked under the sink, and down here, in the shadows, it shattered completely. I wiped my hands on the rag at my hip, staring at the rusted pipe. I couldn't do it. I couldn't just be the plumber. I took a breath, steeling myself for something harder than turning a seized valve, and turned around to face her. The furnace hummed a low, rhythmic chant, and the smell of damp concrete filled my lungs. Down here, the storm outside and the leaking study felt like abstract concepts miles away. The only reality was the 10 feet of stained concrete between me and the woman who had once made me wish I could disappear. Hazel stood by the main stack, the pipe wrench hanging heavy in her right hand. She didn't move toward me. She didn't retreat. She just stood there, backlit by the single bulb dangling from the joists, casting a shadow that stretched long and distorted across the floor. Then she moved. It wasn't a step forward, but a shift in posture. She tucked the wrench into her belt and grabbed a rag, wiping her hands with a slow, deliberate friction. It looked less like she was cleaning off grease and more like she was trying to scrub away a layer of armor she no longer wanted to wear. The gesture was unexpectedly vulnerable, a stripping down of the professional facade she'd worn since the front door. "I can't do this," she said. Her voice was low, bouncing off the concrete walls, stripped of the rough command tone she used for the plumbing. "I can't be down here, taking your money, fixing your house, and pretend I don't know who I am, who I was." I stiffened, my arms crossing instinctively over my chest, a barrier of bone and wool against whatever was coming. I expected a justification. I expected the standard script of the reformed bully. I was young, I was stupid, I didn't mean it. I braced myself for the excuses that would allow me to keep my anger polished and sharp. "I was a nightmare to you, Camilla," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. The green in them was dark, serious. "I didn't just tease you. I hunted you. I made you feel unsafe in your own school. And I did it because it made me feel big when I felt small everywhere else. It was cruel. It was deliberate. And I am sorry." The words hung in the stagnant air like dust motes caught in a sunbeam, suspended, undeniable and illuminating. There was no but. There was no however. She didn't blame her parents, or the water in the town, or the stupidity of youth. She just laid the ugly truth of it on the concrete floor between us and owned it. My defensive walls, The ones I had spent a decade reinforcing with academic achievements and geographical distance didn't just crack, they dissolved. I stood there, mouth slightly open, grappling with a profound confusion. I wanted to hate her. Hate was safe. Hate was a known quantity with clear borders. But it is impossible to maintain a pure, crystalline hatred for someone who is currently standing in your basement, covered in sweat and spiderwebs, saving your home from ruin while looking you in the eye and handing you a loaded gun. "Why now?" I asked. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the hum of the furnace. "You could have just fixed the pipe and left." "Because I'm not that kid anymore," Hazel said, and she took half a step forward, then stopped, respecting the line I hadn't drawn, but clearly needed. "And I needed you to know that the person under your floorboards isn't the same one who shoved you in the hallway. I can't change the past, Camilla, but I can fix the damn leak." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, vibrating with a frequency I hadn't felt before. The fear that had been a cold knot in my stomach since I opened the door began to unfurl, changing state. It wasn't vanishing, it was transmuting into a steady, resonant hum. I looked at her, really looked at her, without the filter of 16-year-old trauma. I saw the fatigue in the set of her shoulders, the honesty in her stance, the capability in her hands. "Okay," I breathed out, the word barely audible. "Okay." It wasn't forgiveness, not fully. Forgiveness is a long road, but it was a truce, it was a lowering of weapons. The air in the basement seemed to shift, the pressure equalizing. The oppressive weight of the history between us lifted just enough to let oxygen back into the room. Hazel exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that slumped her shoulders. She offered a tentative, crooked smile. Not the smirk of a predator, but the relief of a sinner, granted a stay of execution. "Right," she said, her voice rougher now, clearing her throat. "Right. Well, the main valve is freed up, but the line is still compromised. We need to sweat a new joint on the copper before I can turn the water back on. It's going to get hot down here." She turned back to the pipes, reaching for a propane torch, but the dynamic had fundamentally altered. I wasn't just the client watching the intruder anymore. I was in the trench with her. And as the spark of the striker lit the torch with a sharp hiss, illuminating the sharp angles of her face in a sudden wash of blue flame, I realized with a jolt that I didn't want to leave. I wanted to see what else she could fix. I thumbed the striker, and the torch snapped to life, a cone of blue fire roaring into the damp silence. The noise was a shield, a wall of aggressive sound I could hide behind while I tried to reassemble my scattered composure. I focused entirely on the copper pipe in front of me. This part of the trade is elemental. Fire, metal, and the chemical magic of flux. I watched the flame lick the underside of the joint, waiting for that split-second shift in the metal's color that signals it is ready to drink. The flux bubbled and hissed, spitting tiny droplets as it did its work, releasing an acidic, sharp scent that cut through the musty basement air like a knife. It was aggressive and chemical, a stark contrast to the sterile, lavender-scented world upstairs. I touched the silver wire to the seam, and it flashed, melting instantly and sucking deep into the fitting against gravity. Capillary action. It's a simple law of physics. Nature abhors a vacuum, and liquid will always rush to fill the empty space. It was harder to ignore the vacuum opening up in my chest. I killed the gas, and the roar died instantly, leaving the room ringing with a sudden, profound quiet. The only sound was the tick-tick-tick of the cooling copper, and the heavy rhythmic thud of my own pulse in my ears. I was hyper-aware of her. Camilla hadn't moved. She was standing in the shadows just beyond the circle of light cast by my work lamp, but I could feel her gaze like a physical touch, a phantom hand resting between my shoulder blades. It wasn't the fearful, darting glare of a victim anymore, scanning for an escape route. This was something weightier, something that felt dangerously like curiosity. My shirt was plastered to my back, soaked through with sweat that had nothing to do with the propane torch and everything to do with the woman watching me work. The air in the basement felt compressed, thick with a tension that coiled tight in my stomach, pulling at me. "You're dehydrated," she said. Her voice was closer than I expected, startling me out of the trance of the cooling metal. I turned, wiping the grit from my forehead with my bicep. She was holding a glass of water, the condensation on the outside mirroring the sheen on my skin. I reached for it, my hand still trembling slightly from the torque of the wrench and the adrenaline of the apology. When I took the glass, my fingers wrapped over hers. The contact was a shock to the system. Her skin was cool, smooth, and shocking against my heat-flushed palm. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers tightened imperceptibly around the glass, anchoring us together in the dim light. She held on for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, her dark eyes tracking the movement of my throat as I tipped my head back to drink. The water was ice cold, grounding me, but it did nothing to cool the fire starting in my chest. "Thanks," I murmured, lowering the glass. I handed it back, our knuckles brushing again, a deliberate slow friction that sent a jolt of static straight to my toes. I leaned back against the stone foundation, crossing my arms to hide the fact that my hands wanted to reach out. "You did good, Camilla," I said, my voice dropping to that low, resonant register that usually meant trouble. "This house, your career, you built a fortress down here." "I built a hiding place," she corrected, her voice steady but soft, her eyes searching my face for any sign of the old mockery. She found none. "Maybe," I conceded, stepping a little closer, invading her personal space just enough to test the perimeter. The sound of her shallow breathing was loud in the sudden quiet, a counter rhythm to the cooling pipe's tick. "But it takes a hell of a lot of strength to keep walls this high. You aren't the scared kid I remember. You're formidable. You took the wreckage we left you with and built a cathedral out of it." The word hung there, heavy and loaded. Formidable. It was a plumber's compliment, sturdy, enduring, structural. She looked up at me, her breath hitching slightly. "And you're not the brute I remember." "I'm trying," I said, holding her gaze, refusing to blink. "But I'm still rough around the edges." "I can see that," she whispered. Her eyes dropped to my arms, to the grease smudged on my skin, then back up to my eyes. The look was unflinching. It was hungry. The heat in the basement was rising. It wasn't just the residual warmth of the torch. It was the magnetic pull between us, a force as undeniable as the water rushing through the pipes I'd just fixed. I wanted to close the gap. I wanted to see if she tasted like the forgiveness she'd just offered. "The main line is solid," I said, the words feeling thick in my mouth. "Water's on, but I need to check the crawl space. There's a junction back there that might have taken stress." "Show me," she said. If the basement was the subconscious of the house, the crawl space was its primitive lizard brain. A narrow, dirt-floored artery running behind the foundation wall, accessible only through a panel half hidden by the water heater. It was a place of cobwebs and claustrophobia, a space I hadn't entered since I was 12. Yet, when Hazel gestured toward the small, dark square, I didn't hesitate. I followed her. We had to slide in. The space was impossibly tight, a suffocating embrace of earth and timber that forced us into a proximity that shattered any remaining illusion of personal space. Hazel went first, dragging her tool bag, and I followed, clutching the heavy flashlight like a talisman. We ended up shoulder to shoulder in the dark, sitting cross-legged on the packed earth, the ceiling joists barely clearing our heads. The air here was dead still, smelling of dry dust and the raw, mineral scent of the earth itself, but that ancient smell was rapidly being colonized by the immediate, overwhelming scent of hazel. In the close dark, the heat coming off her was a physical weight. I could feel the radiation of her body working hard, a solid wall of warmth pressing against the cool dampness of the crawl space. It was a proximity that bypassed my logic centers entirely. I sat there, holding the light steady on the cluster of pipes she was inspecting, and realized my hands were trembling. Not from fear. The fear had evaporated in the main room, but from a vibration that felt suspiciously like anticipation. "Point it there," Hazel murmured, her voice sounding different in the cramped acoustic space. Deeper. Vibrating in the floorboards we sat on. She pointed to a junction of pipes tucked deep in the corner behind where I was sitting. "I need to check that pressure relief valve. It looks like it took a hit when the main surged." To reach it, she didn't ask me to move. There was nowhere to move. Instead, she shifted her weight, rising onto her knees. She leaned over me. The physics of the moment were undeniable. To reach the pipe, she had to cage me against the rough concrete wall, her left hand planted on the dirt next to my hip, her right arm reaching across my chest to get to the valve. I pressed my back against the foundation, trapping myself willingly between the cold stone and the radiating heat of her body. She was hovering inches from me. I could feel the warmth coming off her skin in waves. Her torso was a solid, heavy presence, effectively pinning me in place. If I breathed in too deeply, my chest would brush against her shirt. So, I didn't breathe. I held the air in my lungs, my heart hammering a frantic, wet rhythm against my ribs that I was certain she could hear. "Steady," she whispered, though I wasn't sure if she was talking to herself, the pipe, or me. She worked the valve, her face turned toward her task, which gave me a terrifyingly clear view of her profile in the harsh sidelight of the flashlight beam. I traced the sharp line of her jaw, the damp hair clinging to her temple, the focused tension in her brow. This close, the bully narrative didn't just disintegrate, it was rewritten. She wasn't a monster, she was just a woman. A beautiful, powerful, terrifyingly capable woman who was currently shielding me with her body. Then the wrench slipped, just a fraction. Her hand jerked, and her weight shifted. Her chest bumped against mine, a solid, warm collision, and she froze. She didn't pull back. She didn't apologize. She slowly turned her head, and suddenly we were staring at each other from a distance of 3 inches. The flashlight beam was pointed at the wall, casting us in a diffuse, shadowy glow, but I could see her eyes perfectly. They were unflinching. That was the only word for it. They weren't scanning for weakness anymore. They were mapping the terrain of my face with a hunger that stole the breath I was holding. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, lingered there with a heavy, palpable weight, and then dragged back up to my eyes. The silence in the crawl space was deafening. It was filled with the sound of our breathing. Hers a little ragged, mine shallow and fast. The air between us felt compressed, the oxygen thin and heavy. I knew I should say something. I should make a joke, check the time, ask about the invoice. I should reassert the boundaries of client and contractor. But I didn't want boundaries. I realized with a jolt of clarity that was as sharp as the earlier fear that I didn't want her to move. I liked the weight of her hovering over me. I liked the threat that wasn't a threat. I liked that the woman who had once made me feel powerless was now the only thing holding my world together. "The valve is fine," she said, her voice a low rumble that I felt in my own chest. She didn't move away. She stayed there, bracing herself over me, her eyes asking a question that had nothing to do with plumbing. "Good," I whispered, the word catching in my throat. "That's good." We stayed like that for a count of 10, suspended in the dust and the dark, the heat rising between us, neither of us willing to break the seal on the moment. The job was technically finished. The leak was fixed. But looking at her, with the smell of rain and cedar filling my head, I knew the real trouble was just beginning. Backing out of the crawl space felt like a retreat from a holy site. I had to slide backward, dragging my knees over the packed earth, moving from the superheated, pressurized intimacy of that dark corner back into the cold, fluorescent reality of the wider basement. When I finally stood up, brushing the dust from my canvas pants, the loss of her immediate proximity hit me like a sudden drop in temperature. I offered a hand to help her up, and for a second, as she gripped my forearm to hoist herself out of the hole, we were tangled again, gravity and leverage conspiring to keep us close. But then she was on her feet, stepping back, smoothing her sweater, and the professional distance snapped back into place like a rubber band against skin. I turned to my tools. Usually the breakdown is a rhythm I can do in my sleep: wipe the wrench, retract the jaws, slot it into the leather loop, snap the bag shut. It's the period at the end of the sentence. But tonight, my hands felt heavy, clumsy. I found myself wiping the same spot on my channel locks 3 times, staring at the steel just to avoid looking at her. The silence in the basement had changed texture again. It wasn't the heavy dread of arrival, nor the charged static of the work. It was melancholy now. The furnace clicked off, leaving us in a quiet so profound I could hear the settle of the house, the wood contracting as it dried. "So," Camilla said, her voice startlingly loud. "It's fixed." "It's fixed," I confirmed, finally dropping the wrench into the bag. The metal-on-metal clatter sounded aggressive. "Final. Main line is clear, pressure is holding, and the crawl space junction is solid. You won't have any more trouble." "Right," she said. She was hugging her elbows, standing just outside the circle of my work light. "The invoice? Do you have a tablet or something, or should I write a check?" The mention of payment felt obscene. It was the correct, logical next step. I am a tradesperson. She is a client. This is a transaction. But after the crawl space, after the confession, after her breath hitching, when I leaned over her, taking her money felt like cheapening a sacrament. It reduced the heat between us to a service call. I wanted to tell her to keep it. I wanted to say that fixing her pipes was the least I could do for the years I spent breaking her spirit. But that would be unprofessional, and worse, it would be pity. And Camilla Vargas didn't need my pity. "I can write it up upstairs," I said, my voice tight. "Standard emergency rate plus materials." "Okay," she nodded. "I'll go get my checkbook." She turned to the stairs, but she didn't ascend. She lingered on the bottom step, her hand resting on the banister. I turned away, needing a moment, and walked over to the utility sink in the corner. It was a deep, stained basin, a relic of the house's original construction. I twisted the tap, and the water hammered out, cold and clear, thanks to my work. I pumped the orange pumice soap from the dispenser mounted on the wall, the grit feeling like sand between my palms. As I scrubbed the grease and flux from my skin, watching the gray suds swirl down the drain, I felt her eyes on me again. I didn't need to turn around to know she was watching. The sensation was a physical weight on my shoulders, but it wasn't the terrified scrutiny of a victim waiting for a blow. It was something else. I looked up, catching her reflection in the dark window above the sink. She was studying me. Her gaze traced the line of my back, the movement of my shoulders as I scrubbed. In high school, my physical presence had been a threat to her. I was too big, too loud, too much. Now I saw a shift in the way she held herself. She wasn't shrinking, she was leaning in. The fear had metabolized into admiration. She was looking at my hands not as weapons, but as instruments. It was a validation I hadn't known I was starving for until that exact moment. I shut off the water and grabbed a paper towel, drying my hands with slow, deliberate movements. I turned around, leaning my hip against the sink, crossing my clean arms over my chest. We were at a stalemate. Neither of us wanted to move to the next scene. "You're good at this," she said softly. I didn't know you had this in you. The patience. I didn't have it back then, I admitted, tossing the paper towel into the trash. I had to learn it. You can't force a pipe, Camilla. You have to understand the pressure. You have to respect the material. If you bully the metal, it breaks. Took me a long time to realize people work the same way. She stepped off the stair, closing the distance between us again. "Is that why you came? To show me you learned?" I looked at her, really looked at her. The confident explorer mask slipped. I couldn't lie to her. Not down here. "I didn't come for the invoice, Camilla," I said, my voice dropping to a register that was barely above a whisper. "When I saw your address, I almost canceled. I almost threw the phone out the window. But I came because I needed to know if I had broken you. I needed to know if the damage I did was permanent." I paused, letting the truth hang in the air between us. "And maybe, selfishly, I wanted to see if you'd let me fix something for you. Just one thing, to balance the scales." Her eyes widened slightly, the green flecks catching the light. "The scales aren't balanced, Hazel," she said, her voice steady. "But the leak is stopped." "Yeah," I breathed, pushing off the sink and picking up my heavy tool bag. The weight of it grounded me. "The leak is stopped. Come upstairs," she said, turning finally to the staircase. "Let's settle the bill." I followed her up the wooden steps, watching her ascend into the light of her ordered world. I was leaving the basement, the place where we had forged this strange, sweaty truce, and moving toward the door. I knew I should walk through it and never look back, but as I watched the sway of her hips and the set of her spine, I knew the hardest part of the job wasn't the rusted valve or the tight crawl space. It was going to be walking away when everything in me wanted to stay and see what else we could build. We stood at the front door, the final barrier between the charged, intimate atmosphere we had generated inside and the wet, indifferent world waiting out on the driveway. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a bruised violet twilight that filtered through the transom window, casting long, soft shadows across the entryway. The silence in the house had returned, but it was no longer the sterile, empty quiet I had cultivated for years. It was a vibrating, expectant silence, the kind that exists in the split second after a bell is struck, before the sound fully dissipates. I held the check in my hand. It was a small, rectangular piece of paper that represented a significant sum, yet it felt absurdly inadequate. It was a transaction. It was clean. It was the way adults ended a service contract. But as I looked at Hazel, standing there with her heavy tool bag slung over one shoulder, her thumb hooked into the belt loop of her canvas pants, the idea of reducing the last 2 hours to a financial exchange felt like a betrayal. "Here," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the small space, "for the emergency call and the materials." Hazel took the check. Her fingers were rough, stained with the indelible gray of plumbing grease and the dirt from my crawl space. She didn't look at the amount. She just folded it once, crisp and precise, and tucked it into her back pocket. "Thanks," she said. She shifted her weight, looking at the door, then back at me. The movement was hesitant, a crack in her armor. I should get going." let you get back to your order." She reached for the doorknob. Her hand, broad and capable, hovered over the brass. Her fingers twitched, not quite gripping the metal, her knuckles white with the tension of holding back. I could see her truck through the side light, a dark shape in the driveway. But I looked at the line of her back, at the way her t-shirt clung to her shoulder blades, damp with the sweat of saving my home. I thought about the way she had shielded me in the crawl space, the heat of her body, a fortress against the dark. I realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that if she walked out that door, the house would be watertight, but it would be empty again. And I was done with empty. "Hazel?" I said. She froze. The hand on the doorknob didn't turn. She slowly rotated back toward me, her expression guarded, waiting for the final recrimination or the forgotten instruction. "The invoice is settled," I said, taking a step forward, invading the professional perimeter she was trying to reestablish. "But we aren't square?" Her brow furrowed slightly. "Camilla, I told you. I didn't come here to—" "I know," I interrupted. "You came to fix the leak. You did that. But you also walked into my basement and apologized for 10 years of history. You don't get to just drop that on the floor and drive away." I took another step. The distance between us was now measured in inches. I could smell the cedar sawdust again, warm and earthy, mixing with the scent of the rain-cooled air coming off the glass. The tension in the hallway spiked, shifting from the adrenaline of the repair to something far more volatile. The air felt taut, a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. "What do you want, Camilla?" she asked, her voice dropping to a rough whisper. Her eyes were searching my face, scanning for a trap, but finding only an open door. "I want to know who you are when you aren't holding a wrench," I said. I reached out. It was a terrifying gesture, bridging a gap that had existed since we were 16. My hand found the space between her tool bag strap and her neck, my fingers resting lightly on the warm skin of her shoulder. I felt her muscle jump under my touch, an involuntary reaction to the contact. She didn't pull away. She leaned into it, just a fraction of an inch. "I'm messy," she warned, her gaze dropping to my mouth and staying there. "I'm covered in crawlspace dirt and flux. I'm not part of this world you built." "I don't care about the dirt," I said, my thumb tracing the line of her collarbone, feeling the pulse hammering at the base of her throat. "And I'm tired of this world being so clean." Hazel let out a breath that was half sigh, half surrender. The tool bag slid from her shoulder, hitting the floor with a heavy thud that echoed like a gavel. She reached up, her hand hesitating for a heartbeat before cupping my jaw. Her palm was callous and rough, a stark contrast to my skin, but her touch was reverent. It was the touch of someone handling something precious they were afraid to break. "I'm not leaving," she murmured, her thumb brushing over my cheekbone. Her eyes were unflinching now, dark with a hunger that she was finally allowing to surface. "Unless you tell me to." "Don't go," I whispered. The gap closed. There was no more hesitation. The door remained shut, the rain stayed outside, and Hazel stayed in. The house was quiet now, but the silence was no longer hollow. The leak in the study had threatened to destroy my sanctuary, but instead, it had washed away the foundations of a decade-long grudge. As I led Hazel toward the kitchen, leaving the muddy footprints on the hardwood for tomorrow, I realized the disaster hadn't ruined my home. It had finally allowed me to inhabit it. If you've ever found love in the wreckage of the past, subscribe to follow the renovation.